Jimmy on the beat, boy. Jimmy on the beat, boy. Jimmy on the beat, boy.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Gin College Podcast. I'm your host, as always, John J. II, here with my co-host, Cody Almasi. Cody, how are we doing today?
Feeling good, brother. Another day, another week of college football gone. It's flying past us. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it's really cruising. It's really going by quickly. We're getting down here to the nitty-gritty, to the finish here in a couple weeks, and we couldn't be more excited. It's really happening. And it seems like just yesterday that we had the beginning of the college football season. And now we're really starting to talk about playoff pictures. We're talking about teams in the top 4, even top 6 that will be in the conversation for sure going into Selection Sunday. And it's really exciting to see everything get pieced together, especially amidst so much speculation from early on going into now. So we're excited to see that. We got a big show for you guys today, a recap show of the past week of college football, also moving forward into the final weeks. So we're going to have a good show for you today, talking about college football playoff rankings and things of that nature. So big show. Really happy to have you guys with us, for those of you tuning in live and those of you watching and listening later on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcasts. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the college football playoff rankings. I got them sitting right here in front of me. The new rankings will be released tomorrow, Tuesday, the 16th of November. But let's just kind of take a look at who we have in the top 4 right now and how these will shift. So the top 6 is from 1 going to 6, Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, Ohio State, Cincy, and Michigan at 6 to round it off in the current college football playoff rankings. How are we feeling about these rankings, and how do you see them changing or shifting going into tomorrow, Cody?
Yeah, I think besides Oregon in there, me and you are kind of on the same page after this week going forward with our top 6 as they are. I don't know. We just kind of don't have too much respect for the Oregon Ducks for some reason. No offense to them, but these other teams, we have them a little higher on our list. Yeah, not too much should change because unlike us, they didn't have the Sooners up there. They had them sitting back there at 8. So that loss will just drop them out of the top 10. Won't have too much changing. I can see maybe Ohio State jumping Oregon after they looked so good against the Boilermakers. Oregon didn't look bad against Washington State, but nothing really I didn't see a highlight from it. Didn't really hear about the game. So didn't get too much media attention, to say the least.
Yeah, I don't see that shifting a whole lot other than Ohio State, maybe, Cincinnati. I don't see them scooting into the top 4 right now. But with a loss from any of these top 4 teams, Oregon's got Utah coming up. So that's going to be a big game. A lot of analysts and things of that nature, people of that nature in that field are expecting Oregon to go on the road and not perform as well as a lot of people may expect them to. So that could really open the door for Cincinnati and the Bearcats, as well as some of those teams in the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th spots. Oklahoma likely getting knocked out of that top 10 race in the college football playoff rankings. So we'll have to see what happens, see what transpires going forward. I guess, let's talk about our top 6 right now and maybe talk about why we have certain teams in certain positions going into tomorrow when the official rankings will be released. Just go through your top 6 if you want to, Cody, and then I'll talk about my top 6.
Yeah, we got a little bit of a couple more discrepancies in our top 6 here this week. Gives us a little more to debate. We both got Georgia sitting there at the 1 spot. We'll talk about that later, but really just a dominant performance all year, especially on the defensive end, just shutting teams down, completely obliterating any offensive game plan that they try to put together against the Bulldogs. Number 2, I got the Buckeyes. Just a little bit of recency bias, looking so good against the Boilermakers. Like I said, Alabama looking susceptible last week, not so much this week, but they played I'm in the show. They played FCS team, not FCS, but who was it? Who did they play? New Mexico State Aggies. That's what it is. And then number 4, I got Cincinnati rounding out the top 4, the last playoff spot there, looking pretty good against South Florida, even though the whole state of Florida looks kind of rough from a football perspective. And then the next 2 in, I got our 2 schools. I got your Sparties at 5 and my Michigan Wolverines at 6. Still going to give them the edge. They got the head-to-head win and can't take that away from them.
Yeah, I think our top 6 are pretty similar. Not seeing a whole lot of movement there in the top 6 compared to what the official top 6 rankings are in the college football playoff rankings. So number 1, I obviously got Georgia taking care of Tennessee, getting the job done in that game at Tennessee. The Bearcats got it done against USF and really manhandled them. And that was we saw that coming quite a bit, but upsets are always going to happen. I like Cincinnati at number 2. It might be, a lot of people are saying, oh, why are you putting Cincinnati? They're not a Power 5 team. Why are you putting them in the top 2? I like them in the top 2 because I see their tenacity. I really like the Bearcats and what they've been able to prove to me over the last 2 seasons, not just this season, but the last 2 seasons. Then Ohio State manhandling the Purdue Boilermakers, the Spoilermakers as they were known after they beat my own Michigan State Spartans. But they obviously deserve that spot. CJ Stroud and that Ohio State offense has really proved themselves, and they've grown and developed into a great Ohio State team this year, as they've shown us in a lot of years past. Then you got Alabama at number 4. Like you said, they beat New Mexico State pretty considerably, covered that 50-point spread with ease. They cut it a little bit close. I would say the bookies got that one pretty close. I think it was within 6 or 7 points. They had that spread covered by. And then I got Michigan at number 5 and then Michigan State at number 6. The reason I have Michigan ahead Michigan State, and people are going to, the Paul Finnebombs of the world are going to be pissed off at me for having Michigan above Michigan State. And this just shows our objectivity. If you look at the 5 and 6 position from both of our rankings, you have my Spartans at 5 and Michigan at 6. I got your Wolverines at 5 and my Spartans at 6. Basically, the reason I have that is because Purdue was a considerably worse team than Michigan. So for them to beat Michigan State, they deserve to put Michigan State at the 6th position and leave Michigan at the 5 position, regardless of the fact that Michigan State beat Michigan in conference play. And there's going to be speculation. There's going to be differing opinions on that issue and on that ranking where that number's at. But I like Michigan State at the 6th position. Still gives them opportunities to move up going into the final weeks. Obviously, we got Ohio State going into the next couple weeks. We got Ohio State next week, and I believe Michigan has it the following week. Is that right?
Yeah, we're down to the last 2 weeks.
So, I mean, if you see Michigan and Michigan State squeeze out a win against Ohio State, I can see Ohio State get knocked out. And worst case scenario, one of our teams is going to be 5, not 6. So it's a win out scenario for both of our teams. And that's how it is for a lot of teams in the Big Ten. That really makes the Big Ten East very interesting if somehow Ohio State can lose even one game to either my Spartans or your Wolverines. That really kind of shifts the entire table, shifts the deck, and shuffles it quite a bit. And so that's what I'm really looking to see is have one of these teams stir the pot, not only for the college football playoff rankings, but also for the Big Ten East, because that is up for grabs. As we both know, going into the final weeks, there's opportunities for any of these 3 teams in the top of the Big Ten East to grow and succeed and to find their place in the number 1 spot. And anyone has the capability to make it to that number 1 spot. Nobody is out of the race yet.
Yeah, these are all elimination games at this point, especially in the Big Ten East. All these teams have a shot, and all their destinies have to be decided and will be decided in the coming weeks. So it's going to get dicey, folks.
Yeah, it is. That brings us to the Big Ten standings. We'll talk about this briefly. We have the Big Ten standings, both East and West, right in front of us here on our graphs. So we'll just talk about that a little bit. How are you feeling about the Big Ten rankings right now, Cody? What are we looking at in the Big Ten East? We'll start with the East, and then we'll move on to the West. What are we looking like?
OSU, they just dropped that game to the Ducks early on. So they're in the best positioning, and they're on an 8-game win streak, I believe. And, Sparty and my Wolverines kind of have to regroup only on 1- and 2-game winning streaks. So Buckeyes are where they want to be. And I hope the Sparties can get that first. Yeah, I would love to see both our teams beat them, honestly. That's the best case scenario for me. Just kind of get them out of there. We both win out. And at that point, it depends on what happens with other teams, but who knows what could happen, our 2 teams.
Yeah, what really makes an interesting scenario is if Michigan beats Ohio State and State beats Ohio State, then what do you do about the top 4? Because how do you shuffle Michigan State and Michigan once you get to that point? Who, can that decision be made to basically interweave or, interchange one of those 2 teams? Because that would basically put Michigan and Michigan State in a similar scenario to be chosen for that 4th spot at the very worst. If they continue to win out and they both win out, I mean, that really poses a difficult dilemma for the college football playoff, the selection committee, to decide where do they draw the line, where do they give chips to certain teams, where do they give props to certain teams? How is that decision going to be made?
The college football playoff committee, I know it comes down to money. I know it. If you guys somehow can manipulate this for a Michigan State rematch in the college football playoffs, it will be the most watched college football game of all time. Best ratings ever, guaranteed. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts. So, hey, make it happen.
I love that. Make it happen. The people want to see it. The ratings were through the roof for the first matchup. I mean, it's a matchup made in heaven if it comes to that point, because it's basically a toss-up within not only the Big Ten, but then you can kind of quantify it. Well, yeah, Purdue beat Michigan State, so that kind of puts them, in a certain position, but it qualifies for a possible constellation game just because Michigan State did beat Michigan. And if they're both in that position where they could fight for that 4th spot, I don't see why anyone would shy away from having an extra game thrown in there, especially with conversations of expanding the playoff and the amount of teams anyways. I mean, I don't think it's out of the question.
Georgia, they were both in the playoffs one time, so that's my dream there. So it would depend on who it would get to the Big Ten championship, what happened there, obviously. But say Cincinnati, they stumble in their ACC championship game. That's the kind of thing that will open the door up for one of these teams to slide in and get another spot.
Exactly. And then you got Oregon going on the road too. They're in the top 4. So if they stumble and fall out of that top 4, then it really opens the door for a lot of these teams in the 5-6 position.
I got the Utah Utes they're gonna crash that party. I didn't know they had them left on the schedule. Yeah. I like the Utah Utes and what they've been doing this year, especially if you look at the adversity as far as not actually on the field, but they had 2 players actually pass. And they were like best friends, and I might do a G&T on that because that deserves some, that's a story that needs to be told right there. But the Utah Utes, they're doing something special this year, so I'd love to see them ruin the party for the Oregon Ducks.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great gin and tonic topic for you to do and take on, because I think that people want to hear about that, and that might be a more or less underestimated story that there's a good amount of people that are interested in, but there's not enough people that are interested in it enough. So I think a lot of them have to be educated and updated on what's going on there. So I think that's a great idea. But yeah, anything can happen once that team, say Oregon does lose, which I think a lot of teams, if you're not Oregon or an Oregon fan, you're rooting against Oregon at this point. You don't think they deserve to be in the top 4. And then a lot of people are rooting against Cincinnati too. That could knock them out of the top 5, top 6. And then if Ohio State loses, then the door is wide open. Then who you got? Alabama and Georgia, which it looks like they're both shoo-ins going into the college football playoff rankings, the final rankings on Selection Sunday when we moved into bowl games and who certain teams are playing going into the final weeks. So a lot can happen going into the final stretch here, and I'm looking forward to it to get really dicey and to have a lot of movement within that top 4 or top 6 spots, because I think it's very possible, and I think it can happen very easily, more easily than maybe a lot of people would expect. So a lot can happen. Let's move on to the Big Ten West, though. We got Wisconsin in the number 1 spot. Then you got Iowa, which has faced a lot of adversity this year. Then you got Minnesota, Purdue, which is inching their way up. How are we feeling about the Big Ten West? Is it set in stone, or is there still opportunities for movement?
Definitely some opportunities for movement. Wisconsin still has to play Minnesota. Iowa just beat Minnesota in a nail biter this weekend. That's a good matchup. So a lot to be determined there. A lot could still shuffle in these last 2 games, but you got to like what the Wisconsin Badgers have done. Another impressive win against Northwestern, and I think that's 7 in a row for them. So starting 1-3 and to now be 7-3, or that's what they are. So they've won 6 in a row, but still they've put together quite a run when everything looked pretty bleak early on in the season.
Yeah, definitely. They've done the job and they got it done, and they really fought back to make something out of this season, and it's looking good. It's looking good. Here's a scenario for you that kind of really stirs the pot. What happens, because a lot of people are speculating whoever wins the Big Ten conference once the Big Ten championship has passed us, that hypothetically, people have said that hypothetically guarantees them a spot in the top 4, top 5, top 6. How does the tide get turned? Say some team, don't know who it will be yet. Say a team in the Big Ten West beats whoever's first in the Big Ten East. How does that change the picture?
So that's almost the opposite. So that could play out in a couple different ways. I was about to say it might be beneficial. Say Michigan State wins out, and so does Michigan. I think that Michigan State would still win the Big Ten East because you got us head to head. And so you guys go to the Big Ten championship, and then we sit there at 11-1. And I almost would rather be the Wolverines at 11-1, not have to play a scrappy Big Ten West team. You know what I'm saying? Play Wisconsin in this rhythm, this mode. I don't want to go rematch Wisconsin on a neutral field. I mean, we beat them at home, but that was a completely different team. So who knows? Thanks for asking that question, because that poses quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's just a good question to ask, just to pose and put out there. It's kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit in the question asking department, but we'll have to see what happens and just see how that plays out. But that would definitely pose a very interesting scenario, whether that happens or not.
Reminds me of Justin Fields' last bowl game, not playoff game, but as a championship game as a Buckeye when he played Wisconsin and they went down and everybody was rooting for Wisconsin. It was a night game, Big Ten championship. And then Justin Fields really demonstrated how electric the Buckeye offense could be and just scored at will in the second half to shut the Badgers down. I think that was Jack Cohn playing quarterback for the Badgers too. So just it's getting to that time of year, you're starting to reminisce on big playoff games. And even when I was watching Michigan Penn State, which we're about to talk about, I'm like, this isn't the third to last game. And this is 2 great teams, classic rivalry matchup. You really got to enjoy every game of college football you watch right now, because we got less in front of us than we do behind us. So enjoy it while it's here, folks. It'll be gone again in just a month or 2.
Yeah, I mean, I said this once before on a Gin College podcast, talking about how we're actually lucky to have Michigan or have college basketball to look forward to. We do have football to look back at, once all the bowl games are finished up, but it's kind of a good thing to look ahead at. but it's a small blip within the year that we have college football. So definitely take advantage of it. Make sure you're watching all these games, these 50-50 games, all the Big Ten games leading up to the Big Ten championship. It's only going to be here for a little bit, folks, and it's going to be gone before you know it. So take advantage of it while you're here and while college football is here. Let's move on. Let's talk about Michigan-Penn State. Let's talk about Michigan-Penn State in Happy Valley. That was a nail-biter for Michigan fans. That could have went either way in a lot of moments. Talk to me about that game. What was going through your head as a Michigan fan, Cody?
Yeah, never was really able to get too comfortable watching it. I did see a lot of things I liked. Obviously, we got to talk about just the two freak athletes on the Michigan defensive line in David Ajabo and Aiden Hutchinson. These dudes are getting national recognition at this point and just absolutely lighting up. They had 5 sacks on Saturday between the two of them. They have 19 on the year. David Ajabo, who this is his first year playing, getting starting time, has 5 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery. So just hats off to them. Both going to go in the first round of the draft, and just going to enjoy the last little bit I have watching them in the maize and blue. They really were able to get after Sean Clifford and never let them get into rhythm. Like I said, the 7 sacks, 12 total tackles for losses. So, it came down to it. Penn State tried. They had an 11-point surge there at the end that had me sweating. I thought I was about to leave the restaurant salty again, be like, fuck the show, John. But, yeah, it was rough. I thought I was scared there for a minute, but when it all came down to it, game on the line, 5 handoffs in a row to Hassan Haskins. He's basically wearing our whole team as a backpack at this point. The rest of the running back room is depleted. He carried the ball 31 times. Those last 5 ones set up the go-ahead 47-yard touchdown strike to Eric All. I don't know if you guys seen it, but just diving, barely made it in, kicked the pylon as he went out of bounds. And that's the first time he's really got some action since he got hurt in the MSU game. And you've seen Jim Harbaugh really hand the interview off to him after the game. And that's the kind of stuff you love to see. That's why you have Jim Harbaugh as coach. And it was good to see him come away with the win in this one. And Cade McNamara, besides a fumble that was forced by a good Penn State play near the end, en route to their 11-point comeback, almost comeback, Cade McNamara fumbled the ball. He got smoked. Awesome sack by the Penn State defense, but dropped the ball. Besides that, clean game, 247 yards, 3 touchdowns, and some pretty passes. So I was impressed.
A lot of pressure on Cade McNamara this week I saw from the Penn State Nittany Lions, and that's going to continue going down the stretch here. We're going to see that against Michigan State in the final week of conference play of the regular season, and this Penn State defense is relentless. They're not giving up, and they had opportunities to beat Michigan, but they just squandered them, and Michigan really closed the door on them somewhat late in the game, and it really decided the factor that their offense really outplayed their defense when everything's said and done, got them in position to get the field goals when they needed them, to get touchdowns when they needed them. And it was a close game, but they at least won it, and Michigan covered. So big wins all over the place, no matter what you're taking. The under actually hitting that game, 48, relatively close under over there. But, what are you going to do? It's going to happen. So
no JJ McCarthy for the first time since September 25th against Rutgers. So pretty interesting to see. I think you asked me the question if we were going to keep going with the 2 quarterback system. So I think Jim said, hey, Cade, it's your game. I hope he has the reins the rest of the season. I mean, if things get a little loose against Maryland, get JJ in there, whatever. But, it's Cade's season, and I think now Cade is he looks each game. I mean, I know there's some points where he's not really explosive or lighting up the numbers, but he's looking more poised, more mature with each game. And I think he's going to give JJ a run for the starting spot next year as well. So it'll be interesting to see how the quarterback situation gets handled next offseason, but getting ahead of myself here.
Yeah, I think it's important to get JJ the touches he wants. I think it was a scare. It was a wake-up call against the Michigan State Spartans when they had the 2 quarterback offense going. They had that system going. They had the regimens. They had a wake-up call saying, you know what, we might as well stay with and stick with Cade McNamara going forward. JJ is too much of a liability right now to run the 2 quarterback offense, and we just got to do what we got to do to get wins, especially in decision time, and especially with the stakes being so high with the college football playoff rankings as well as the Big Ten standings. So a lot to play for, a lot to lose, and they got to
One
make
question
calculated
before we
decisions.
move on. What did you think about, James Franklin, he showed a little special teams prowess, a little trickiness. He pulls off the fake punt, and then I think on the next drive goes for the fake field goal from the 2-yard line, and just complete disaster the second time he tries to reach in the special teams bag. What do you think about the call?
I respect the call. I respect the call, similar to the Kansas Jayhawks going for 2 in overtime. We'll talk about that later, but we were live tweeting this. We were both tweeting at each other and tweeting at others on the Twitter landscape, the Twitter world, about this play. Make a decision, go for it. Don't do the fake field goal. If you're going to do a fake field goal, run it and do it more, more decisively. I think it was too much of a half-ass fake field goal to the point where it really didn't reap any rewards. And that could have been the game, real easy. It could have been the game right there. But, because they didn't really run a play, they weren't decisive. I don't know if they've ran that play that much in practice. They had to have, since it's in the playbook and they're willing to run it in a game. But it just wasn't decisive enough, and you're not going to fool this Michigan defense on a half-ass fake field goal. So it
Thank
wasn't
you
enough.
to whoever made this a noon game, because that Penn State crowd is fucking ferocious at 12 in the morning, or 12 in the afternoon. So 7:30, that crowd might have had a little bit more effect on the game.
Yeah, I think they were still waking up. They might have had a rough night the night before, or didn't have enough coffee, or
Yeah,
not
they
enough
started to come
drinks that
alive
early.
in that 11-point surge there, especially when that tight end came down with that tough pass, and then Jahan Dotson caught that 2-point conversion, which I'm so sick of seeing teams
incredible.
convert 2-point conversions on Michigan. Like, it's at will at this point.
I mean, if there's a stat for the amount of 2-point conversions allowed by a defense, I mean, Michigan's got to be up there.
Yeah, we got to be competing for the one spot.
Exactly. Good deal. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Baylor, Oklahoma. Obviously, another big game that really had a lot to do with the college football playoffs and the rankings. Big game for the Baylor Bears, beating the Oklahoma Sooners 27-14. What do we see in this game? We saw a little flip of the script by having Spencer Rattler come in and relieve Caleb Williams halfway through the game. What did we see in that game? Were we surprised, or did we see this coming? I called it before. I've called it early in the season that I saw a loss coming to Oklahoma very soon. I didn't know when it was going to come. Happened to be this past weekend against Baylor. But what did we see? What were we expecting to see, and what were we surprised about?
Yeah, I think that just everything finally caught up to them. All the times they got away with the skin of their teeth in every game and just fought out of those. I finally caught up to them, and the Baylor Bears defense deserves some credit, because what they did against the Sooners is pretty impressive. They held them to their lowest yards amount total since in 7 years, since all of Lincoln Riley's tenure as head coach, and then 2 years as offensive coordinator, and the lowest point total since 2014. So just some resounding lows for the Oklahoma Sooners offense. And like you said, flipping of the script, the savior of the season, Caleb Williams, couldn't even get it done. Only 50% of his passes completed for less than 150 yards and 2 interceptions, I believe, and just couldn't get it done. Spencer Rattler came in, and he had some lackluster numbers of his own. The Baylor D, they had 5 sacks, 9 total tackles for losses, and just gotta really, we gotta put some respect on the Baylor Bears name now. And I obviously not the college football playoff, 2 losses, but they're right in play for the Big 12 championship. And some of that antics off the field, you see the storm, the field storming, what happened there? Yep, extra 3 points to get just that little bit of extra if it comes down to it, and Oklahoma suffers another loss. The Big 12 standings open wide up.
Yeah, definitely a big time. And the Baylor Bears held the Sooners to their lowest point total since 2014, a pretty staggering statistic to be noted there. And just to be able to limit this Oklahoma offense, which has been very versatile, which has been very lethal up until recently. We've seen that happen. We've seen different things happen and go wrong, and we've seen changing of certain players, certain personnel within that Oklahoma team to see that happen and to see certain changes be made and still reap no rewards, it really speaks to the Oklahoma Sooners and their ability to lose games. It's a true ability to be able to go out, win week after week, win in 50-50 games and games like against Texas and other games like that, where you see them find their struggles and you see them bounce back and you see them reach adversity and really persevere through it. That's something that's very important to see and very important to note when you're going forward. And to see them crumble against the Baylor Bears was something that was unprecedented, but I think we all expected to see, sooner than later. I expected to see Oklahoma fall before this, but their time finally came against the Baylor Bears. So it was a time. It was a long time coming, I guess, basically, for lack of a better word. It was a long time coming, but it is what it is. And they're falling well out of the top 10 going forward into the college football playoff rankings. Good stuff. All right, let's move on to Purdue and Ohio State. The Buckeyes finally beat the Purdue Boilermakers, beat them by a considerable margin, 59-31. They cover that 19-point spread considerably. CJ Stroud and that offense are just absolutely ruthless. They're, unprecedented. This is what we expect to see out of an Ohio State team. This is what we need to see if they want to do good for those Ohio State fans out there. And that's just going to be something that we're going to see more and more. So, Cody, what do we see in this Buckeyes Boilermakers matchup? We expect the Boilermakers to come out and give Ohio State a contest. We expected them to see, some better opportunities on offense. They got shut down quite a bit by the Buckeyes defense, but what do we see in this game that we were surprised about?
I think everybody was hoping to see a loss here, especially you and I as Michigan State fans. Anybody who just doesn't like the Buckeyes, even though there's so much at stake, I think everybody just kind of wants to see them take a loss. But they kind of proved us all wrong and proved themselves right. Ryan Day said he wasn't too worried, but they just hadn't been able to establish the rhythm that they wanted the last couple of weeks. And so this was just, they were hitting on all cylinders. Garrett Wilson, 4 touchdowns, 3 in the air, 1 on the ground. So when you got your receivers running for 51-yard touchdown scores, that says a lot about the versatility of your offense, especially when it's against a Big Ten opponent who's been known to be a giant killer and not just some run-of-the-mill school, So CJ Stroud looked really good. So did Aiden O'Connell and David Bell, the dynamic duo from Purdue, but just wasn't enough. Could not keep up with the high-octane Buckeyes.
Yeah, I think some accolades are to be given to the Ohio State defense and the lack of power within the Purdue defense to allow so many points, 59 points against Ohio State. So that really didn't help the dynamic duo on the Purdue offensive side to really do their job and get the job done. The Aiden O'Connell Bell duo, you saw some successes, but their defense just didn't hold up and didn't really allow that duo to really do as much damage as we would have expected to see out of them. So it is what it is. And I mean, it's not really too much of a surprise to see Ohio State beat Purdue. But after they beat Michigan State, we obviously knew about their vulnerabilities, Michigan State's, that is, going into the Purdue game. So we saw that, and there was considerable amount of worry, especially from a lot of big time Michigan State analysts, fans, even like myself. I wasn't too vocal about it, but those concerns were there going into Purdue, which were very real and proved to be even more real than we expected. So that's going to be one that hurts us down the road once the rankings and things like that are decided. But big win for the Buckeyes, and they move on. And that just makes the Big Ten East even more interesting by having them win. And it's going to get more interesting as Ohio State and Michigan State face off. Then Ohio State and Michigan, that's going to be a big game. And then even if it's just a fight between 1 and 2, I mean, even if State loses against Ohio State and Michigan beats Ohio State, then that top 2 spot, I mean, you got the same rankings, you got the same wins and losses in your conference. How do you decide that? I guess, how do you decide what team gets ahead of the other if you get into that scenario?
In the Big Ten East?
Yeah, like say Michigan State loses to Ohio State, Michigan beats Ohio State. That puts them both at whatever amount of wins and won in the conference in your division. I guess how do you decide that? Because I mean, I would put Michigan ahead of Ohio State, I think, at that point, because Michigan does have a loss in the conference. Ohio State would then have a loss in the conference, but since they lost to Michigan, they're, their team that's right behind them, that would have to put Michigan in one spot, wouldn't it?
I think it starts to get to the combined records of our Big Ten West opponents at that point. It gets really, really strange and convoluted. They go into some weird choosing processes when it starts to get that tight. So I hope it doesn't have to go to that, because that just seems like it would take all the fun out of it. But
yeah,
we'll see what happens,
Yeah, because then it's just the luck of the draw. What analysts or what people on the back end decide, basically, who do they want to be in the top spot at that point? You can't really quantify it as far as statistics. I mean, you can if you look at the head-to-head matchup, but it's basically down to their discretion. Who do they want to be in the top spot? Who do they want to be at number 2, number 3? And that those top three positions could get real interesting going down the stretch here. Definitely interesting if Michigan State and Michigan beat Ohio State, but I think it also gets very interesting even if State loses to Ohio State and Michigan beats Ohio State. Then things get maybe a little bit more complicated than they would from the former of the two. So we'll consider that. We'll be talking about that a lot more, and we'll be probably analyzing that a lot more going into Michigan State, Ohio State coming up this weekend. And that one's in Ohio State. So that's going to be a big matchup, and it's going to be a huge contest for Michigan State. Basically determines their season and where they're going to finish. Still going to get a very prominent and very promising bowl game no matter what happens in that game, but that really decides the rest of their season and where they're going to stand in the college football rankings. So let's move on now. Let's talk about Ole Miss and Texas A&M. We didn't really see the fire out of Texas A&M's defense. Couldn't stop Ole Miss, and they won 29-19. Slightly covered that under that I called out last Friday, but wasn't really what I expected. I guess, what did you see in this game, Cody, that you think should be noted?
Yeah, I was surprised to see Ole Miss have success on the running game as much as I did. Texas A&M, we've talked about their defense multiple times this year. They were a 1.5 point favorite. They just come off that 20-3 win against Auburn where no offensive touchdowns were scored. So I guess they're only scoring 19 we maybe could have foresaw, but 29 points from Ole Miss, and not really too many of them coming from Matt Corral. I mean, he had a touchdown and 247 yards, but usually he goes off for a couple scores. He's running all over the place. Wasn't the case. They used a committee of running backs and then an aggressive defense. 2 picks in the fourth quarter to really seal the deal. And it just, Texas A&M would be a completely different team if they had a different quarterback, just someone who decent, someone who could lead your team a little bit. But Zach Calzada has looked lackluster, to say the least. 12 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, only a QBR of 50.6. So no matter what your defense is doing, it's hard to get wins when that's what your quarterback is bringing to the table. So you got to ask yourself, who would Texas A&M be if they would have had a gunslinger back there, But that's the way the cards are dealt.
Yeah, I've seen the Texas A&M and the Aggies defense diminish quite a bit since they were put in the top 5, and maybe that had to do with the commentators and analysts gassing them up, putting them in the top 5 defense, causing them to considerably drop down lower and lower and lower in the defensive rankings as far as the college football analytics are concerned. As far as points allowed, yards allowed, things of that nature, that's the type of statistic that determine the strength of a defense. And just kind of it was enough. It was enough to cover that under. It wasn't enough to win the game. Obviously, not enough power and tenacity on the offensive side for Texas A&M. Just got ousted and bettered. They got played out basically by Ole Miss and the Rebels. So it was a big win for the Rebels. Huge win. Puts them at 8-2. So it definitely gives them.
They're kind of just waiting for Alabama to slip up still, and then they're right there to be tied with them. But they got Alabama has the head-to-head, but still they're just kind of playing for a great bowl game as well going forward next year. They're going to have to bring in a good recruit to replace Matt Corral because we're going to lose. The Rebels, not where I'm not a Ole Miss fan, but going to be losing him to the draft most likely. So It'll be interesting to see what Lane Kiffin has up his sleeve and what he builds on going forward.
Definitely, it will be. It will be indeed. Let's talk about the final game in our featured game list to recap this week. Let's talk about Kansas and the Jayhawks battling against the Texas Longhorns. Crazy game. I watched the finish of this game. The only thing that pissed me off is that I live betted Kansas against Texas. I think it was 35-14 when I live bet this. They still had Kansas at -4. I'm like, -4, they're up 35-14. Like, more than 2 touchdowns.
Yeah.
You got to be able to cover this game and keep that streak going. And Texas and their offense just really fought back. They got the job done and brought it to overtime. Crazy overtime finish with Texas scoring that touchdown late. Kansas did not cover the spread, which I expected them to make a defensive stand going down the stretch in that final drive from Texas. But it went to overtime and then finished in a crazy way with Kansas scoring the rebuttal touchdown in overtime and then going for 2 to get the win. So what did you see in that game? Did you have the pleasure to watch that game, or did you just watch highlights?
Yeah, I was sound asleep at that point.
That was late. That was on late.
It was indeed. Yep.
That was one of the later games.
Longer day, headed off, so full of football. I was already cashed out by the time these two schools were playing. But Texas is kind of a good example how you can look. Like you could be a fan of the Texas Longhorns. You know, that could be what you are. So it could always be worse for your college football team, having that big name and then just laying an egg. And as far as Kansas goes, a basketball school, I think on Friday's show, I gave a little nod to Ochai Agbaji from the Kansas Jayhawks hoop teams. Had no idea I was going to be shouting out anybody on the Kansas football team for pulling off a miracle here in Texas. So, yeah, well, what happened to Texas? I'm not really sure. They got Steve Sarkisian, supposed to be a great head coach coming from Alabama, and things have really just gone off the rails.
I didn't even know Kansas had a football team until this game. But to see them come down the field and especially that play call to go for 2, because you just gotta get a field goal or an extra point that puts Texas back on the 25, and you have multiple runs in overtime. You have multiple overtime sessions or quarters, whatever you want to call it. Unlike the NFL, where you only have that one overtime session to get the job done.
I think he was just he's seen that Illinois Penn State game early on. He said, "There's no reason we should even be here at this game." He fucking said, "I got some big cojones," and he went for dose, and it worked.
He probably walked out of the field with his cojones in a wheelbarrow.
Yeah, he might have just earned himself a higher profile coaching job with that.
Oh, definitely. Just that play call in itself. I mean, that definitely propels Kansas to beat Texas. I mean, Texas, granted, is not having the best season either. They're finishing out. They're kind of tapering off in their season, not really finishing too well. But to beat Texas, being Kansas, which, like you just heard me say, I didn't even know Kansas had a football team. Definitely by far and beyond a basketball school. To have them score this amount of points, first of all, to have this amount of points be scored 57-56, that's a crazy, whatever you want to call it, final total, whatever you want to call it. And that over smashed, by the way, for those of you guys that didn't know. But crazy performance, crazy win for Kansas. Got to give it to them.
Yep. Hats off to the Jayhawks football team. Stakes all around.
Yeah, mistakes all around. They capitalized on Texas. And something we want to just talk about regarding this game, we can say, what's wrong with Texas? We talked a little bit about before the show and pre-show stuff. Talked about NIL. How has NIL affected these players? Maybe not just at Texas, but we can use Texas as a prime example. How has NIL really put the damper on certain teams in NIL credibility?
You know, we can't blame it all on NIL just because Texas, as far as a football program, doesn't have the best track record over the last decade. But they are one of the better schools in recruiting, in brand name, image and likeness, all that type of thing. People around here in Michigan wear Longhorn stuff, have been since we were kids, you know what I'm saying, wearing the burnt orange. So just they get these big names. Xavier Worthy, one of them, dude's putting up 150 yards every game, 3 touchdowns, but it's not equating to win. So it just seems like everyone's there for themselves, for the show, to put up numbers, to be a star, to wear the jersey, and not there to win games and win championships. And one of their coaches, Bo Davis, he really got into the Longhorns on their way home from the loss against Iowa State. And you guys can go listen to it let him hear it. I'm not going to give you my Bo Davis impression, but he had some chosen words. They weren't the kindest, but he was trying to light a fire under that team's ass, and that's what needs to be done. Somebody needs to step up as a leader. Somebody on the bus recorded him, submitted it, and I think that just kind of shows that you have those players while you're sitting there trying to lay your heart on the line and tell them that this sport means so much to you and that Texas is a winning program and you need to understand what it is. One of your players is recording you doing that and posting it for likes. So I think that tells the story in itself.
Yeah, it definitely does. And to not give the coach the undivided attention. I guess partially I do thank that player, whoever it was, for posting that and recording it just for our viewing pleasure, because that definitely got the viewing pleasure out of me and you. So, and I'm sure it did out of a lot of people. But just to touch on the NIL thing a little bit more, and not to even say this is only happening in Texas, this is happening everywhere in every Power 5 school or any school that really thinks that, if a player is playing for that school thinking, oh, I'm hot shit now because I play for, whether even it's Missouri, Ole Miss, Alabama, Texas, Texas A&M, Michigan State. This happens everywhere. So to capitalize on the NIL, we're seeing the bottom end of the stick. We're seeing the dark side of NIL rewards and things like that. Since these schools are allowing these guys to receive payments and things like that based on their NIL, it's taking away from that college or that school's credibility once they, either attain so much losses, or if they're getting wins, then that boosts their NIL. And I think it boils down to how much credibility does that team have based on how they're performing on the field week after week, because it really comes down to what are they performing, how are they doing, what numbers are they putting up, are they winning games, are they in contention in the top 10, are they in contention for the college football playoff? Are they going to make it to a good bowl game? And all these things have to be considered because the NIL in and of itself, based on your personal persona, based on what you're putting out to the world, that carries less weight than if you're going out week after week, performing, getting the job done. Because that NIL stuff, that'll come later. If you make it to the league, you don't have to worry about NIL because that's all going to follow suit. The NIL in and of itself, just playing for the school, regardless of wins, regardless of credibility, the novelty of that wears off relatively quickly.
You think Kenneth Walker was concerned about NIL before the season started?
I don't think so.
But
no, and that's a perfect example. I was going to say that too. And he puts it all on the field, and that's going to give him all the credibility he could ever want just because he's performing the way he is on the field week after week. So,
yes,
the NIL stuff will come later. The players that realize that early on will be the ones that are most successful down the road, period.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yep. So good deal. All right. That brings us towards the end of the show. Cody, do you have any closing statements you want to leave the people with until we speak again on Friday?
Not too much. I think we've got some Sparty and Wolverine basketball this week. So lock in, both teams getting acquainted. These games, they're good to watch. They don't mean too much when it's all said and done, but it's good to see which players of your team are going to be there making plays come crunch time.
Yeah, definitely. And make sure to focus and stay tuned for all the college basketball footage and all the coverage that we're going to be providing you guys later on. But we really just want to finish out strong in college football right now. We want to make sure we give it our full attention while everything is still in the balance. So many decisions are yet to be made based on certain happenings and certain, outcomes of games. So we want to make sure we give college football the attention it deserves. Like we said earlier in the show, we have it for a short blip within the year. We have it for a short time. We have to take advantage of it while it's here. You blink and it's gone. I've said this before. I remember the first game, Georgia and Clemson. I remember making an Instagram video for it and put it on the GSN Instagram and the Gin College one. So, that seems like just yesterday to me. We're starting to talk about college football playoffs and leading up to Selection Sunday. It's already going to be gone before we know it. We're starting to open our eyes right now from that blink. So we got to be focused on that. We're going to get hard and heavy into college basketball very soon, though. We're going to start easing our way into it as the college football playoff gets more interesting. We might even diversify and just have our shows be strictly about college football playoff stuff and college basketball, just to kind of split the time up, do it a little bit better. Talk briefly, I'm saying very briefly, about games that happened that past week, but we're mostly going to be talking about games and matchups that are regarding the top 6 teams that will bring themselves into contention down the stretch and into the college football playoff, the top 4. Once Selection Sunday happens, then it's all going to be about Selection Sunday and those top 4 teams, whichever teams they may be. They are still to be determined.
slow college basketball in between bowl season to talk about all the teams behind the top 6.
Oh, yeah, we're going to have tons of time to talk about college basketball. It is a decently long season, but that's another one too. You blink and it's March. That March really comes quickly. And after that, we're going to just basically everything's going to be a recap until football season starts again. So stay tuned and make sure you're with us the entire way. Make sure to follow both of us on Twitter. Our handles are underneath our nameplates, and it's in the description of the podcast as well. Make sure to check out all of our links on social media via our link tree at the bottom of the screen and also in our description. And we'll be posted to all things college sports. So make sure you don't miss a thing and stay posted with all the updates we provide. I'll leave it at that, though, guys. Thank you for tuning into this edition of the Gin College Podcast. I'm your host, as always, John J. II with Cody Almasi. Have a great night.